Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mayor Michael D. Tubbs, Mayor, City of Stockton, California.
Good afternoon. I'm really excited to be with you all here today because today's my 1-year anniversary of being Mayor of Stockton. So as Mayor of the City of Stockton, I thought I had ownership of my name. I thought surely the only other Michael Tubbs out there would be my father. But on August 11th, I was in for a rude awakening. I was on Twitter, and I was getting all these mentions about how Michael Tubbs was in Charlottesville, Virginia, protesting in support of white supremacy. And I said, well, look at me. I'm not some Dave Chappelle skit. How is that possible? And then I discovered that there was another Michael Tubbs. He's very passionate like I am. I've never met the guy, but I read. He's very passionate like I am. He has a big sense of what's right and what's wrong with his country. He's interested in establishing some sort of white supremacist state. And actually 27 years ago, the year I was born, he was arrested for trying to bomb Black and Jewish businesses. Now I want to start with Michael Tubbs because I think, well, the other Michael Tubbs. I want to start with him because I think, as we've seen in the past year, it's a vestige of the past in terms of some of the thinking, but it's also very, very current, and also a challenge collectively we have to solve. I think growing up in Stockton, California, a lot of those attitudes really motivated me. I was born, my mom, she had me when she was a teenager. My father's been incarcerated my entire life. And growing up, I had a huge chip on my shoulder to prove that, number one, poor people weren't lazy. That oftentimes people weren't poor because of some moral failings or because they didn't care or they didn't try or they lacked grit or resiliency. And also as a young Black man, I felt the burden of proving that I wasn't inherently criminal, I wasn't inherently dangerous, I wasn't inherently bad. And being from Stockton, California, a city of 315,000 people, 80 miles away, but in many respects, a world away. A community like many other communities with great assets, great people, great diversity, but real issues. So I thought in 7th grade when I read this poem by Tupac Shakur about this rose that grew from concrete, that was what I was going to be. And the poem goes like this. It goes, have you heard of the rose that grew from the crack in the concrete, proving nature's laws wrong and learned to walk without having feet? Funny it seems, but by keeping its dreams and learned to breathe fresh air, long live the rose that grew from the crack in the concrete when no one else cared. So growing up, that was my impetus. That was my focus. I thought if I work hard enough, if I study enough, if I pull myself up by my bootstraps, if I do everything right, then I will avail myself to every opportunity present in this country. And also because of that attitude growing up, I had a sense of almost condescension towards other people from similar communities with similar family structures who maybe didn't quote unquote work as hard as me or do as much as me. And I took that attitude with me to Stanford University. As I left Stockton as a 17-year-old, I left thinking I would never come back. I left thinking that I had proved that meritocracy is correct. That all you have to do is work hard, and even if you have to work 3 or 4 times as hard as other people, if you work hard, that's all that's necessary for you to be a success. And again, I think a lot of that was motivated by my dad being incarcerated. A lot of that was motivated by my mom having me in high school and being on welfare for the first 5 years of my life. But I thought I figured it out, that the attitude that the other Michael Tubbs has is false, and it's false because if I work hard, I can prove them wrong. But then in Halloween 2010, I was in for another rude awakening. At this point, I was interning in the former administration's White House as an intern in intergovernmental affairs, and my job was to work with mayors and councils nationwide. I didn't really enjoy the job, but I was in the White House, and that's like a big deal, so I was really happy and proud of myself. But on Halloween 2010, the next day, I came to work, and my mom called me. She called, and my mom's not the most emotional person, so when she called crying, I knew something was up. And she told me that one of my first cousins was murdered back home at a house party. And for me, that was a real kind of awakening. It was a real kind of come to Jesus moment. And it was, okay, well, you left Stockton, you worked hard, you got out. What if you went back and just showed people, if you work hard enough, things aren't fair, but everything will be all right. If you make all the right choices and you do everything correct and you go to house parties like that, you'll be fine. And I was really motivated by my Judo-Christian upbringing and around this story of the Good Samaritan. And you guys know the story, but I'll tell it briefly. Apparently 1,000 years ago, at least what Jesus said, there was some guy walking down the road, the Jericho road, and he was walking, got beat up, left on the side of the road essentially to die. And then the story goes, a Levi, like a priest, saw the man on the side of the road, probably thought, well, hey, maybe he chose to be on the side of the road, like he did something bad, and this is God's punishment for him to be left on the side of the road. Or maybe he was late for church or something, so he left. And then I'm gonna do a 2017 version. So then maybe a young politician from Stockton came by and saw the man on the side of the road and said, well, you know, late for a meeting, again, maybe this man made choices. If he had rode his horse hard enough and maybe whipped the horse a little bit faster, he could have outran the robbers, and maybe then he would not beat on the side of the road. And then finally, a good Samaritan saw the man on the side of the road. He decided to get off his high horse, got down on the ground with him, gave him Band-Aids, gave him aspirin. Then not only that, sent him to the Regent Hotel, paid for it, made sure he was good, and then went on his way. And I thought that was then the policy solution. It was like, well, hey, Michael, you've been blessed, you've been successful, maybe to prove these attitudes around white supremacy and the inherent failings of poor people, that maybe I just need to be like a good Samaritan and just get dirty and get down and help individuals as I can and show them that by their own hard work, they can do that. So that's what motivated me to run for city council. In 2012, I ran with this good Samaritan impulse. And then a crazy thing happened. I got elected. So in 2013, I was elected, and I realized that all the nonprofits, all the programs, all the things that we were involved in or doing were important, but they were necessary but not sufficient. Because I don't know if any of you guys have been to the Jericho Road, but Dr. King tells it beautifully. He says, well, the road, in many respects, is structured for violence. It's 200 feet below sea level. It's conducive for ambushing. So at the time the Good Samaritan helped the one guy get off the side of the road, by the time he got back, there's probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 people left on the side of the road because although the Good Samaritan did a good deed, the structure of the road was unchanged. And that was an aha moment for me as a council member because I realized we were running mentorship programs and everything was like program, and we were helping some people. But in terms of the scale we were interested in, we weren't getting it. And I submit to you today that a lot of it is from what I wish he was my friend. He's my friend because I read his books. Dr. Paul Farmer calls structural violence. He says oftentimes we talk about every community and we talk about people who are victims of violence or things, the outcomes aren't so much other communities. He says oftentimes the blame is put, again, on the individual, on the person. But he challenged us to think about how structures can be violent or how our society, in many respects, is structured for people not to reach their full potential. And he defines structural violence as the avoidable impairment of basic human needs. Basic human needs like access to preschool. Or basic human needs like access to a grocery store instead of liquor stores. Basic human needs like not going to sleep hearing gunshots. Basic human needs like going to a good school, probably like the schools we want all our kids to go to. And he talks about that's the reason why that leads to a lot of these inequities we see in society. So again, 22 years old, in city council, doing all these readings and noticing like, wow, we could do all this programmatic stuff, but until we get serious about fighting structural violence, then our work will really be in vain. So today I want to submit to you sort of the frame we're using to reinvent Stockton. And not saying we have all the answers. We definitely have issues, but this is how we're thinking in terms of what it will take to really transform our community to ensure that Michael Tubbs is not a singular story, well, this Michael Tubbs, that this Michael Tubbs is not a singular story, but the story of all the wonderful children that call our community home. So the first thing around sort of fighting structural violence is this idea of equality versus equity. And it's a little bit ironic because I understand I'm speaking at an equality summit, which is great, but equity demands a little bit more, and I think the picture shows it all. That you see when everyone's equal, it's not, the outcomes aren't necessarily as equal as they can be because people are starting at different starting points. But when things are equitable, then everyone gets what they need to reach their potential. And especially when we think about marginalized community, marginalized groups, marginalized people, that's what's required. It's not enough to treat everyone equally when everyone's starting at vastly different starting points. The second frame we're using in terms of how we're organizing ourselves in Stockton is this idea of charity versus justice. And again, I think the Good Samaritan parable is a good kind of synopsis of that, but essentially it's this. I define charity as necessary but not sufficient for the outcomes I want to see in terms of Stockton being a safe community, a thriving community, a destination community where people want to live and grow their kids. And the difference is not semantic, but it's this. Charity I really define charity as like what I can do as an individual, and justice around sort of what we can do collectively. I think charity takes the assumption that I have something to give you, whether it's a donation, whether it's a check, whether it's an hour of my time. All those things are important, but I think justice isn't saying I don't need to inspire you, but I need to empower you. I don't need to give you anything but the tools to be active architects of the community, world, and society that you want to see. And I think oftentimes we spend so much of our energy on charity and we don't really focus on justice because justice requires conflict sometimes. Justice isn't nice. Like people have died in this country for justice. Like blood has been shed for justice, and it requires oftentimes a level of sacrifice that charity doesn't. And then kind of the last pillar of the work we're endeavoring to do in Stockton is this idea of listening. So if I was a good Samaritan, I would have spent a little bit of time, instead of just going immediately to help the man on the side of the road, to listen and understand what happened that led him to get to the side of the road so that it wouldn't happen again. And I think oftentimes, especially those of us with resources and means and access, we rush so quickly to the solution phase, but there's a lot of deep learning that happens when we listen. And understanding that those closest to the problem, closest to the pain, closest to the issues, have answers. I tell people all the time that I truly believe that talent and intelligence are universal. I don't think this room, I don't think the institution I went to, Stanford, has a monopoly on talent or intelligence at all. I think those things are universal, but oftentimes resources and opportunities are not. So if those of us who really value equality and equity, I think the challenge is how do we organize and orient ourselves to provide resources and opportunities to folks so we're not speaking for them, that we're not giving them, but they're at the table articulating solutions for themselves. So using that frame, we've been focused on investment and not incarceration. Because oftentimes in communities, the response to every issue, whether it's poverty, whether it's crime, whether it's mental health, whatever it is, our first response is more cops, more cops, more cops. So for the past 11 months as a mayor, we've been focused on, number one, the 5 areas in our community that have some of our highest crime rates, but changing the orientation so it's not that these communities need more cops, which may or may not be true, but the community doesn't just suffer from crime. It suffers from, these particular neighborhoods, suffer from poverty, from bad schools, from lack of access to health facilities, from basically everything bad they have in abundance, and everything good is lacking. So we're focusing on, okay, what investments in addition to law enforcement can we make in these communities? And we piloted this in my council district, and we haven't solved all the issues, but we're seeing promising signs of success. And the most promising side is that those who actually live in the neighborhood, who have to be there every single day, are actively part of the solution. So we're able to close down problem liquor stores, we're able to open health clinics, we're able to bring the first bank in that area in 50 years, all from valuing justice over charity, from listening, and from really being focused about how do we invest in this community, understand that the issue isn't just a law enforcement issue, it's a deeper structural, societal issue of structural violence that necessitates a collective impact response. Now as mayor, we're really focused on this program called Advanced Peace, and the idea is that in every community, in terms of the people who drive crime rates, it's generally less than 1% of the population. So in Stockton, it's 82 guys that drive 80% of our violent crime rate. So these 82 guys don't just drive our violent crime rate, but they also drive the perception of our community. Because oftentimes when I'm talking to people, I say I'm from Stockton. Well, first they think I'm saying Compton. And I'm like, no, Stockton. 3 times the size, 315,000 people in Central Valley, almost the state capital 150 years ago. And then they're like, well, crime. And I'm like, well, that's part of the narrative, but Stockton also has the oldest Sikh temple in North America. It had the largest Filipino population outside the Philippines. It has the University of the Pacific and CSU Stanislaus, and the tractor trailers was invented there. There's a lot of good there, but these 80 guys really drive the narrative of our community. And again, historically, our response to those guys has been, look, let's mentor them, or arrest them. But now we're saying let's really have a laser focus on, number one, who these guys are, and number two, figuring out how do we partner with them and invest in them in a way that helps them actualize who they are, who they want to be, and kind of helps them with a lot of the trauma they've encountered in their life. So we'll be rolling that out next year. And then we're also we just announced a couple weeks ago, and time flies when you're having fun, a couple weeks ago we just announced SEED, a universal basic income demonstration. And the idea is simple. Well, first, it's not taxpayer money. It's a grant, $1 million grant, to provide $500 to a select number of families in Stockton for 1 year or 3 years. And unbeknownst to me, that's a controversial idea, I guess. But what's been fascinating to me is really this conversation around what is it that people need when they have a lack of cash. I watch TED Talks, I read, and it seems like the most promising solution is more cash, and especially in a society where wages are stagnating or declining and not keeping up with inflation, and when Bay Area prices are pushing everyone, housing prices up and bills are costing more, and people are working harder and harder for less and less, we thought it was important to illustrate that when you invest in people and give them an opportunity, that they really are good returns on investment. And then finally, we're now orienting and organizing ourselves around this idea of a college promise, and telling our young people, if you do everything right, and if you do everything right individually, and work hard like I did, and study, and good grades, and then we as a community do everything we should do in terms of providing positive inputs, whether it's rigorous, research-based, intelligence, good pre-K and child care, and supports in schools and college counseling, and then when you graduate, we'll make sure that cost and affordability is not a barrier for you going to a 2-year, 4-year, or trade school. So we're building that out. So if you have any people that want to help, please let me know. And I think, especially given the moment we're in this country, the juxtaposition between me and the other Michael Tubbs is an important one. Because I think the juxtaposition is almost as old as America itself. That at any time in this country's history, any move towards equality or equity or providing folks opportunity is generally met with some sort of violent white supremacist backlash. And that's literally history, from Reconstruction to the Civil Rights movement to the last year. But what's encouraging for me is that the history is also true, that when that happens, there's people like us, Good Samaritans, folks who are working hard in tech companies and other places, who find ways to leverage their position, knowledge, and resources to create a more just community. And that's why I drove all the way from Stockton to come here today, to say, number one, you guys have an incredible opportunity to kind of help write the next chapter in our nation's history. I'm obsessed with the Hamilton mixtape and the play, and I really do believe that history does have its eyes on us. If you look through history, it's usually normal people, everyday people, whether a 27-year-old mayor with a dad in jail and a mom who had him young, or a coder, or an engineer, or a seamstress, or a young pastor. It's everyday people who really figure out how do we orient ourselves and use our times, gifts, and talents to make it so the world looks a lot better than how we inherited it. So as I conclude, my favorite story that I always share happened around the same time my cousin was murdered. And it was in April 2011, and I did a Freedom Rides reenactment with the original Freedom Riders. And one guy's name was Bob Singleton, and he said, "Michael, I was arrested on August 4th, 1961. Why was that day important?" And I said, "Well, you were arrested, and if you weren't arrested, we wouldn't be on this ride, so thank you. I'm thankful for the opportunity." And he said, on that day, Barack Obama was born. And he said he had no idea the choice he made as someone with no status, no power, no Salesforce badge for Dreamforce, no clout, just a 20-year-old college student. He said he had no idea that choice would pave the way for a more equal and equitable society oriented toward justice, so that a kid born that day would 50 years later have the chance to be president, when at that time that kid couldn't even get a cup of water or a glass of water at a restaurant. And he said he had no idea if what he was doing would work, no idea if he was going to live or die, had no idea if it was going to be effective, didn't have time to run through complex algorithms and iterate. He said, we just have to do something. And then he looked at me and said, what are you prepared to do today so that 50 years from now, the world looks like you think it should? And I think that's really part of the challenge around Dreamforce and why we're all here today. It's really to figure out we all can't do everything, but everyone can do something. And I think the other Michael Tubbs has a different answer, the answer that I think we all share. And again, the question is, what are we prepared to do today, tomorrow, next week, so that 50 years from now, a child is born to a country in a world that looks different, more equal, and more equitable than the country we have now. And that's to say I'm under no illusions. Things don't happen overnight. Stockton won't be reinvented overnight. But if we don't start now, if we don't do something, the only thing that's guaranteed is nothing changes. And I have a huge issue with being a passive actor. And I know you all do too. So again, I think the question is, in terms of valuing things like equality and equity, in terms of moving us more towards justice and charity, then the question is, what are you prepared to do today, tomorrow, next week, next year, so that 50 years from now, our societies, our communities look like we know what they should, where everyone's given the opportunity to be a coder, and to be a mayor, and to prove lies like white supremacy or xenophobia are inherently false and wrong. Thank you.